Okay, so anarchism and Christianity.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, have you ever heard those two in the same sentence?
Not usually something you see together, that's for sure.
It's like saying, I don't know, jumbo shrimp or something. Makes you do a double take.
Yeah.
But we're diving into Jacques Ellul's book, Anarchism and Christianity. And I gotta say, I'm kind of hooked. This isn't just some random dude. We're talking a professor of law, wrote tons of books, technology, propaganda. So what's the deal? Why is he connecting these two totally different ideas?
Well, Ellul, he was kind of obsessed with, like, these unexpected relationships, and this one takes the cake. I mean, most people, when they hear anarchism, they think no God, no masters, right? Just pure freedom, no rules. And then you've got Christianity, which people usually associate with order, authority, rules, all that.
So, like, are we talking apples and oranges here?
Yeah.
Or is there something more going on?
That's the thing. Ellul argues that a lot of those 19th century anarchists, guys like Bakunin, when they were bashing Christianity, they were actually going after like a warped version of it. The kind of Christianity that gets all mixed up with power and control.
So not the love thy neighbor kind of Christianity.
Not even close. It's like they were fighting a scarecrow instead of the actual enemy.
Oh, I see what you mean.
And Ellul, he backs this up by going right to the Bible itself. He points out all these times where political power is shown to be, well, kind of sketchy.
At best.
Okay, give me an example. Where do we see that playing out in the text?
Well, look at Joseph, right? Or Daniel. They both end up serving these foreign kings. And what happens? The kings, they use that power to oppress the Israelites. It's a whole cautionary tale right there. Don't put all your trust in worldly authority.
And it's not just them. What about when the Israelites demanded a king in the first place? That did not go over well, did it? Not at all. You read 1 Samuel 8, God basically tells them straight up, look, you're asking for a king, you're rejecting me. He's not a fan of them choosing human power over a direct relationship with him. And that's a pretty bold statement for a book that's supposed to be all about blind obedience, don't you think?
Wow. That's pretty intense.
Yeah.
So the Old Testament is way more skeptical of political power than we usually think, huh?
Yeah, absolutely. And Ellul, he argues that this skepticism, it's like a thread that runs through the whole Old Testament. Like, he points to the Book of Chronicles, the kings who are considered good in Chronicles. They're often the ones who weren't, like, super powerful or successful in the world's eyes.
Huh. That's interesting. It's like, usually we think a good king is the one who's out there conquering everyone, expanding his empire.
Right, exactly. But Ellul's saying, look, maybe there's this deeper conflict, between worldly success and being truly faithful to God. It's like true allegiance to God requires a certain humility, recognizing that human power, it's always limited, always has the potential to become corrupt.
So, is Ellul saying it's impossible to be a powerful ruler and a good person? Or is it more complicated than that?
Well, it's definitely not that simple. I mean, think about Ellul's own life. He lived through World War II, saw firsthand the horrors that happen when power runs amok. But he wasn't naive about it. He understood that even with the best intentions, give humans too much power and things can go really, really wrong.
So it's less about judging individuals and more about recognizing that any system where a few people hold all the power, it's inherently dangerous, no matter how good those people might seem.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that power itself, it's a force, needs to be watched, it needs to be held accountable. And Ellul believes that's where the real significance of kingship in the Old Testament comes in.
Okay, you've got my attention. Tell me more.
So Ellul argues that the Old Testament ultimately presents kings as, like, placeholders. They're just standing in for the true Messiah. Their power is temporary, it's limited. Ultimately, in the grand scheme of things, it doesn't really matter.
That's a pretty radical idea.
Right.
It's like saying all human authority is, I don't know, insignificant compared to God.
Exactly. And that brings us to Jesus.
Right, because didn't Jesus say, render unto Caesar?
Yeah.
I've always taken that to mean we have to obey the government.
That's what's so interesting, though, because Ellul's interpretation of that phrase, it's anything but straightforward.
Really? I'm all ears.
Okay, so think about it. Jesus is asked about paying taxes.
Right.
And they show him a Roman coin. Ellul points out that when Jesus says, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's and unto God what is God's, he's talking specifically about Caesar's control over his own creations.
Oh, I see. It's like saying Caesar can have his coins, but my soul, my allegiance to God, that belongs to something higher.
Precisely. And Ellul, he finds even more support for this view in how Jesus says, my kingdom is not of this world. He's not saying earthly power is good or bad. It's more like he's saying it's just not the point. It's irrelevant to the kind of spiritual liberation he's talking about. At least that's how Ellul sees it.
So then how are Christians supposed to approach political power in the here and now? Do we just ignore it?
That's where things get even more interesting. Ellul, he dives into that in the next part of his argument. And
Okay, so we've got Jesus saying, render unto Caesar, but we've also got this, deep suspicion of power running through the whole Bible. So how do we make sense of that? What's the Christian anarchist's take on actually living in a world with governments and power structures?
well, Ellul, he tackles this head on, He looks at another passage that always seems to come up in these conversations, Romans 13, where Paul talks about obeying authority. On the surface, it sounds like case closed. The Bible says obey the government.
Yeah, it always felt a little too simple to me, especially given, everything else we've been talking about.
Exactly. And Ellul thought so too. He dug into the historical context, pointed out that Paul was writing to a community facing some serious persecution. So Ellul's argument is that Paul's message is less about blind obedience and more about, choosing a path of love. Even, and maybe especially, when you're dealing with people who hold power over you.
So it's like, instead of fighting power with more power, you meet it with something even stronger. Love. Even when it's hard. Even when it seems impossible.
That's it. And Ellul's not talking about some kind of passive love. For him, it's an active force. It means constantly pushing back against oppression wherever you see it. You don't necessarily seize control, but you never stop resisting.
This is really making me think differently about all this. We usually talk about politics as this battle for who gets to be in charge, who has the power. But Ellul's saying true change comes from a totally different place.
That's the heart of it, yeah. And this is where Ellul sees something really unique that the Christian perspective brings to anarchism. See, a lot of anarchists, they believe humans are basically good, and it's power that corrupts them. But Ellul's coming from this Christian worldview, right? And that acknowledges the good and the bad in human nature.
Like, we all have the potential for both. It's not like if you just get rid of power, suddenly everyone's going to be perfect angels.
Exactly. And Ellul thinks that awareness, that recognition of our own potential for darkness, it's actually crucial. It keeps us grounded, keeps us from falling into this trap of thinking we can create some perfect utopia.
So it's less about achieving this perfect, power-free society and more about, like you said, constantly fighting for freedom, never taking it for granted, never assuming it's guaranteed.
Exactly. And it's by holding those two things together, the anarchist passion for freedom and this, more realistic view of human nature, that Ellul believes we can create real lasting change.
Wow. This deep dive has really given me a lot to think about. I never would have guessed that anarchism and Christianity would even be on the same page, let alone have so much to say to each other about something as complex as power.
It's funny how these things work out, isn't it? Sometimes the most unexpected pairings lead to the most interesting insights.
That's for sure. Well, if this sparked your curiosity, listeners, we want to hear from you. Head over to our website, leave us your thoughts, and let's keep this conversation going. Until next time, keep diving deeper.